Hey guys, Courtney here. Just wanted to jump in before I get to the content and let you guys know that I have a special webinar coming up on Saturday, November 5th, and it is about Mars reclaiming the warrior within. So, this one is going to be maybe a workshop webinar style type of thing. So, bring your charts ready. If you have questions, of course, come prepared with those. But we're going to be taking a deep dive into looking at Mars and how it will develop in our childhood, and basically how we can kind of take back where we may have been suppressed in some ways in regards to our autonomy, our will, our anger, our assertiveness, our ambition, our masculinity, our entrepreneurial self, our physical self. Those are all aspects of Mars that can be either underdeveloped or suppressed or really supported in our charts. And if you want to learn about this side of yourself and learn how to bring it into balance, then definitely check this one out. It's very near and dear to my heart, so I hope to see you there. The link for that is down below, and I hope you guys have a great day. Hey guys, it's Courtney from Mills Bloom, and today I'm here to talk to you about Saturn and its significations through all of the houses. So we are specifically going to address what Saturn is like in houses 1 through 12 in the birth chart. We're not really going to look as much at the sign of Saturn. I'm going to talk about why, and the transits of Saturn, I'm going to talk about that in another video. Okay, so I guess maybe let me start off with why I'm specifically looking at the houses. This is because Saturn spends about 2.5 years in one sign. So everyone that's within that age range of 2.5 years, in front or behind you, is going to have Saturn in the same sign. So it's not very particular and not very personal. What makes Saturn a personal experience is the fact that it will fall into one specific area of life, and you will feel this Saturn in whichever house it is, as well as whatever houses it rules and whatever aspects are happening from Saturn to other planets. This is how you begin to tie in areas of your life to make the full equation for what this will look like for you. If you're new to astrology or relatively new, you can just look at Saturn in the house and start there. But if you're growing your practice, then you can start to add in these other elements. And of course, if you want it done for you, I can always give you an astrology reading at willowsboom.com. Okay, so let's start off with talking about what Saturn is. So if you guys follow tarot, I believe that the devil card in tarot is representative of Saturn, or at least Capricorn. And they have energies surrounding work. And everyone talks about, yeah, Saturn work, Saturn return. Oh, it's such a hard time of your life where Saturn returns the spot where it was when you were born. And that happens around 29 years old, 30 years old. But if we start paying attention to what really happens for people when they turn 30, when they go from being in their teens and their 20s and exploring themselves to turning 30, you will notice that it's like this rite of passage. It's this maturation process. And that is what Saturn does. It is the Chronos, the god of time. So it is very much accounting how much time we are spending on what. And it is a planet of karma. And so wherever we have it in our chart, we are destined to have some sort of complex or difficult karma in that specific area of our lives. And we are meant to work a lot harder, and there may be more delays, more time that passes in order for us to reach a certain result that might be a lot easier for our peers. And so that's why we can see really famous, successful people who've achieved so much, who have so much money, have horrible relationships, or people who have amazing relationships have, poor money choices, and so on and so forth. And so depending on where Saturn is, its aspects, especially harsh aspects, and if it's aspecting a ton of planets, you might notice that you have more hardships in your life to overcome than other people. But Saturn is a planet of mastery as well. And so it does tend to pay off karmically for the things that we have put into it, the time, the energy, the effort. And then you can normally see this in society. It's not always going to be the case. Life is not so black and white. You're not always going to put effort and get results. But generally, Saturn does like to kind of give us the things that we have worked really hard for. So wherever we see Saturn in our chart, we can understand that we are going to feel that we are inadequate in this area of our life. We as I mentioned, may experience those delays where we feel like we're really striving to catch up with our peers. But oftentimes it's this feeling of, I'm not good enough in this area. And so we can develop quite a bit of fears and insecurities. There can be a lot of holding on tight, so a lot of restrictions, and this feeling of maybe even having this area of life not flow properly, or even being controlled. If this has an aspect to a personal planet like the sun, you may feel like you've had a really restricted or controlling childhood if it's aspecting the moon, for example. So there's lots of ways that we can kind of see this come up in the chart, and it will really depend on the aspects that it has to your personal planets. So I'm thinking about doing a webinar on that. If you guys are interested in that, definitely let me know. So what happens when we have Saturn in our chart? Yes, we have to work a lot harder. Yes, we feel these insecurities, and that usually manifests as either under or overcompensation in this area of our life, as well as feeling like we are stripped of our resources. Saturn is a planet that needs to learn how to master and do something itself and become self-sufficient. So if you have this in a very sensitive area of your chart, like the fourth house, related to your emotional center, your home, your family support, you might actually be stripped of that emotional support. You might actually have to learn how to support and love and kind of almost like parent yourself in a way. And so there are really hard placements of Saturn, and then there are also more functional and easier placements of Saturn. And again, it's not just going to be the house placement, it's going to be its aspects that really show you whether or not this is going to be difficult for you. And another element of traditional astrology is to look whether you are a day or a nighttime chart. So whether the sun is above the first and seventh house, like in the 12th to 8th house range, or is it on the bottom of the chart from the first to the seventh house? If you are on the bottom, you're a nighttime chart. If it's on the top, you're a daytime chart. So Saturn for daytime people is not as negative. It's a more constructive planet because Saturn has aspects of being dense and cold and rigid. And so this kind of material actually works better in the sunlight, in the daylight. When you have the cold night mixed with the cold, dense Saturn, it makes it's just too much of the same element, and it makes one struggle with this more. So it's considered basically the malefic that's less harmful for people in the daytime. So if you're a nighttime chart, you have lots of squares to Saturn, you have Saturn on an angle like the ascendant or the descendant, you may really feel Saturn in your life and be a lot more impacted by a Saturn return at age 30 than somebody else. And so we're going to kind of talk about what that might look like. First of all, in the transit video, I'll talk about Saturn returns and everything like that. But we're going to talk about what that might look like based off of the houses that Saturn is in and how you might have perceived your childhood. Something else that I see with Saturn is oftentimes we will kind of, there can be a self-sabotage that I see with Saturn. So for example, there can be a story or a belief in your head that you act on or kind of pursue and put out there because of that belief. So imagine, for example, that you have Saturn in the seventh house of partnerships. You have this belief because maybe your first partner that you dated was not that great. And so now you've developed a belief about what you are worth and kind of who is out there in terms of potential partners. Maybe you believe that all men really suck, or whatever it is that you have this idea or expectation around or belief around. And then you will start to attract more people like this. And this is why I do think Saturn is a karmic planet. So if we have maybe harmed people or did not commit in past relationships, we will find that we have a lot of commitment and a lot of work and a lot of overcoming to do in our relationships in this lifetime. Or if you kind of abandon a family in your last lifetime, maybe you have Saturn in the fourth house and your family now abandons you, or you have to like work hard to get the love that you deserve, quote unquote. So basically, there is this self-sabotaging aspect where I think there is some kind of karma playing out. I've seen this with someone that I've known in the past who had Saturn in the 12th house, who felt very alone and very isolated at different points of his life. And he would self-isolate. He would not call someone up when he was going through something. He would choose not to have faith or believe in something, which is very Saturn in the 12th house. And so it all kind of compounded to equal more isolation, more hopelessness, and kind of more depressiveness, which actually is kind of classic with Saturn in the 8th and 12th houses. So you can see here how not only is Saturn playing out on its own and providing its own level of difficulties, but we are then contributing to it oftentimes, especially before age 30, before Saturn kind of becomes activated and more constructive and useful, and we make decisions around it. Once we go through our Saturn return, we are able to kind of, as I said, activate our Saturn, and we have more wisdom around those circumstances, and we can often make different choices to have a very different outcome than we had during our youth or during our childhood. And so you may discover that you're attracting these kind of karmic patterns in early life, only to uncover those patterns and work on them and have breakthroughs later in life. Saturn is also a seeker of truth. It has kind of this element that Uranus has as well, where it's having us face reality in a forceful way. Sometimes this can be a little bit aggressive, like, a little bit pessimistic as well. So this is where Saturn feels like a harsh reality check, and not something that plays out gently or plays out easily. It's like we wake up one day and we feel like we're a failure. We reach age 30 at our Saturn return, and we look back on our life and we realize we partied our 20s away. We've worked hard at some things and they've amounted to nothing. And it's probably because they weren't aligned with where we were meant to go. And we have just huge reality checks about, what have I done? What have I done? There's like a sense of my own culpability and responsibility surrounding this planet. So we're going to have certain hardships around it. That's not our fault. But then we also, as I said, contribute to our suffering or to our success with Saturn in terms of how we react to it. So it can have us face those hard truths about what we have done or have not done in our life and how we've kind of ended up where we are. So that is essentially the overview of Saturn. There's actually probably a lot I can say, because when I first started studying astrology, I was like, this planet, this is my planet. I have a Capricorn moon, so it is like the ruler of my moon. But in general, I just find that Saturn is a very potent part of our chart, and you will always feel it in some capacity. You will feel this planet, which is why it was so exciting for me as an astrologer, because it was one of those things that I would call out in someone's chart and explain to them, and it would resonate so deeply, because when you have gone through a certain amount of suffering and hardships and had to work really hard on something, you have learned and ingrained those lessons like there's no tomorrow. You have become one with this process of discovery and of this uphill battle. And so it's not something you take for granted. It's not a gift that you're given that you're like, oh, well, everyone's good at writing or everyone's good at socializing or whatever it is you're good at, which trines can make you kind of take that for granted. Saturn is like, no, I've had to work my ass off to be able to budget and be consistent and take care of my weight or whatever it is. And so you will definitely see this and feel this the most in your chart. All right, let's go ahead and start. I want to break these down. I was saying by the houses. We're going to start off with the water houses, because they will all kind of take on a different theme based off of the element. So what does water entail? Water, of course, entails our emotions. It is really how we are attuned to as children, how we learn to attune to others, our sense of belonging, our ability to process emotions, self-love, whether we feel, again, isolated or like we are supported, intimacy, and then really big, deep-seated insecurities, things that stem back maybe from lifetimes or many family generations. So there is kind of Saturn in a water sign or a water house, emotional house, can be a little bit challenging because of these gentle kind of natures. So let's start off with Saturn in the 4th house in particular. So Saturn in the 4th house of home and family can, as I kind of already alluded to earlier, make us grow up earlier than we would have liked to, or earlier than our peers. And that's because Saturn is a planet of duty and responsibility and criticism. So when it is involved in a relational house, like the 4th, 7th, 11th house, it will have the potential for people in your life to bully you, to take advantage of you. That might be more so Neptune, but if Saturn is retrograde, there are typically issues around boundaries that we have to work out within relationships. And so, again, they can bully you, reject you, take advantage of you, criticize you, control you. All of these are very Saturnian themes, which is why I said it's very obvious in someone's chart. You will feel your Saturn in some way. It's impossible for you not to feel it, especially because it feels heavy or pessimistic or weighed down by kind of the plight of life. And so being in your 4th house, which is where you are growing up as a child, your sense of kind of being understood by the world, as I mentioned earlier, being attuned to, being emotionally seen, observed, cared for, nourished, supported, all of those things become either constricted or there is some type of lack there. So maybe there was like cold emotions within the home. Maybe the parents were really busy working and there was a lot of financial lack. And so because of that, there was a focus more so on production and doing and surviving. This is also very common with Saturn. There can sometimes be such a heavy focus on survival that there are big missteps in the needs surrounding that house, which with the 4th house is maybe the nurturing emotional side of life was really underdeveloped because of the heavy focus on maybe meeting certain financial goals that were going to help them survive. Saturn, the 4th house, is also related to the unconscious mind. The 4th house and the 12th house are invisible parts of the chart. The 4th house is the most invisible. There's the least amount of light in this area of the sky. And then the 12th house just is related to what's hidden. We'll talk about that later. So this is where we have our unconscious programming. This is our mind before we are able to discriminate between what am I, what are they, and it's kind of our process of learning all of those things and who we are, our identity and our emotional selves, what it's like to feel. And so this is a very tender age and tender area of the chart to have Saturn. And so because the 4th house is a kind of hidden part of the house, and I see this with many different planets, it oftentimes takes some digging to even get down to what is happening here or to the root of everything. Or you may have to dig a little bit before you feel that you can utilize the strength of your Saturn and not just be kind of at its whim. So there is something that's almost like we're this primordial goop that is shaped by Saturn, and then it takes us a long time to realize that this has been our container and to step outside of that. So it takes some digging, some unearthing to realize what has contained us and surrounded us since before we were aware of what a container was. And so this is like growing up in a childhood home where it was lacking emotional security and protection, where it was overly controlling. I see this a lot, actually. So a parent feeling like they know what is best and you can't just be and express yourself. So there's a lot of self-censorship that can show up. Just a lack of sympathy, compassion, nurturing, affection that usually comes during childhood. And there can oftentimes be this feeling when Saturn is on the ascendant or in the 4th house, in the 8th house, and sometimes even the 12th house, which is like our pre-birth time. So like our time in the womb in the 12th house. All of these houses can be associated with feeling unwanted. So there can be maybe a process during the pregnancy or after birth or during childhood where there is a feeling like we are a burden. We are not wanted in the family, or our existence is somehow too difficult because maybe there was 8 children and we were the 9th and there wasn't enough time to deal with us and we had to grow up and take care of our brothers and sisters and our parents weren't really there and they could barely afford us. And so part of them maybe didn't really want us there. And so it can really create again, this feeling of being unwanted and not attuned to. And that creates oftentimes a fear around intimacy, a fear around fully showing oneself, because again, the fourth house is very vulnerable, very open, or very hidden part of the chart. And so it's like we don't want to show that soft underbelly to people because during our childhood, it was not something that went well. And so I personally think that Saturn in the fourth house can create a dismissive, avoidant attachment style. This is my one of my theories. I mean, it would be dependent on the rest of the chart, but this is one indicator to me that would show that maybe somebody is not used to people asking them like how their internal world is going. They're not used to people really caring about their emotions or displaying emotions and affection. And so as a result, they can be detached. They can be very self-reliant when it comes to their own emotional needs. They're trying to process and do everything themselves. They have not learned healthy reliance on others and interdependence. And so Saturn in the fourth house here creates this lifelong journey of digging that up, uncovering the roots of that, and really understanding how they've contained themselves emotionally from a young age, and how it's definitely not their fault, but they're likely, feeding this cycle. As I mentioned, Saturn shows where we have to go at it alone, where we have to learn to master something alone. Being in the fourth house of our emotional center, we have to learn how to comfort ourselves. We have to learn how to reparent ourselves, how to process emotions because we were maybe never showed how to process them. And so there may be a perception that people are too busy or don't care to attune to your emotional needs. And I've kind of mentioned that with some of my examples, like the parents who are really busy working, who have a lot of stress going on. And there's oftentimes this feeling like not only do you have to comfort yourself and parent yourself, but you may have to also take care of other home responsibilities. As I mentioned earlier, you may have to take care of your younger siblings, or you may have to take up, like, you may have to work with your family at a young age. There's a sense that your childhood is kind of robbed from you because Saturn is a planet of aging and maturation, and the fourth house is part of our childhood essence. And so we don't really get that full extent of being who we want to be from this young age. And so it's kind of difficult and sad when I see this placement for people, because I feel like they are needing to go back in this lifetime and almost experience their childhood at later stages of life. And this is also true for Saturn in the first house as well. I think I may have alluded to this at the beginning as well, but with the fourth house, there is a heritage or ancestry linked here that Saturn can indicate that there may be some kind of karma within your family line, and also connected to past lives in regards to family. So this is something that runs really, really deep. If we think about the roots of a tree, that is what the fourth house is. It's taking in the nutrients from the emotional environment, the roots do, and brings it up into the rest of your adult life and grows into something that's visible for the world to see. And so what's happening during childhood with Saturn in the fourth house is it's almost like cementing around those roots. So those roots learn how to kind of figure out how to survive, but there is a difficulty in emotional thriving. And so they may feel like they don't even understand themselves emotionally. They may feel like they have a hard time expressing themselves emotionally. There can be a lot really deeply buried. And there's just like a rigidity around the softer, intuitive, emotional, sensitive side of you that you have a potential to have with Saturn in the fourth house. There may also be a lot of this self-censorship or self-monitoring as a result of very critical, controlling, or sometimes even abusive parents. Because the fourth house is our roots, we may struggle to feel like we can fully root somewhere. We might feel like we're never fully satisfied with our home, or we might take a really long time to get the sense of belonging or sense of rootedness in a specific location. And When it comes to owning a home, you might even find that you have to work really hard to get money to be able to own a home, or you might have a lot of like things to fix once you do get a home. Like this would actually be a good placement for a fixer upper. But there may be also delays, and just a lot of effort has to go into creating this sense of home, this sense of family, and also the sense of just emotional expression. So all of these things kind of have smaller windows that you've experienced, like smaller containment. And so you're over time have to push the walls out, learn how to like create that home, express yourself in a bigger way, feel more supported. All those things are, you're going to have to grow out of the cement blocks that were put around your roots. And so it can be hard to create a sense of stability, or on the other hand, you may actually settle down and create stability a lot earlier in life for yourself to recreate the childhood that you maybe lacked, or the support that you maybe lacked. So you could either delay a long time to get a house, and kind of create that for yourself, or you might try to skip ahead. I shouldn't say skip ahead because everyone's life is different, but you may try to very early on, meet a partner, buy a house, have a family, and create that sense of stability and constancy for yourself. So that is what the 4th house looks like. Let's go ahead and jump over to the 8th house. Saturn in the 8th house, which is a house traditionally associated with Scorpio, another water house, is a quite challenging house to have Saturn in, and just a challenging house in general, especially to have a malefic like Saturn or Mars in, and even more so if you're a night chart. So the 8th house is a house of crisis, and oftentimes in my readings with my clients, if I see Saturn here, there is usually some kind of crisis that happens during early childhood. And this can be so many different things. So I will offer some examples, but please do not use this as a limiting factor. There are any number of types of crises people can experience that lead to an emotional distrust of life and of relationships and opening up to relationships. So some examples could be like your mom, like growing up having really extreme postpartum depression and you experiencing this from her. It could be losing a parent from a young age. It could be witnessing divorce and cheating within the home and learning to distrust relationships and intimacy. So there is something going on here where the emotional and physical world of another person, or sometimes an event, is going to impact your emotional and physical world in a way that is disturbing. And I think disturbing is the right word. And of course, I'm looking at kind of the more intense examples and variations of this, and everything is on a spectrum. It will depend on your aspects to Saturn. Maybe you have Saturn trining Jupiter and you have really amazing investments in the 8th house, and there's positive examples of this. So again, don't just take this at like 2D face value. You really have to look at your entire chart and know that astrology is a quite complex science and divination tool. So just consider that. Okay. So the 8th house is essentially where emotions meet relationships, and it can lead, these crises that happen to you lead to huge amounts of self-understanding and discovery, because the 8th house is the rebirth house. And I think of it as the kundalini, or the snake that's eating its own tail, and the cycle. So it's this constant level of purging and rediscovery and integration, and purging or death, rediscovery, integration. And a crisis with Saturn in the 8th house is one of the best ways actually that people discover many things about themselves as well as their personal power. The 8th house is oftentimes where we feel power dynamics come into play in our lives, because it's the house of other people's money. What happens when people are lending you money? They have the power in this dynamic because you owe them something. And this is a very literal way to look at it, but this can come emotionally as well. And so sometimes with Saturn in the 8th house, there can be crises also that turn around the idea of having different power dynamics. So having somebody growing up that was really controlling, or being manipulated or taken advantage of by certain people in your life. And this could even relate, if we look to past lives, to a really traumatic death in a past life that leads to a lot of fear. And so all these things that like Saturn in 8th cultivates are usually a sense of fear around trusting, around vulnerability, or around another crisis like this happening again. And so what happens is I will often see people have trouble with vulnerability and intimacy because they did experience some hardships or crisis, or just some difficult emotional situation with a parent or with someone that they love and felt close to, or a partner in an important stage of their life. And so they then have guards up around letting people in, around that vulnerability. And that makes sense. Obviously, if you did experience people, taking advantage of you, sexually or financially or emotionally, you're going to come at the world from more skepticism, from more uncertainty, and especially when it comes to relationships with others. And so this can sometimes manifest in a very material or physical way where you might not be open to sexual intimacy. So you may fear this area of your life, or you may put a ton of pressure on yourself to perform or to be perfect in this area of life. It's like over monitoring yourself around intimacy, emotional and sexually. And so there can be almost like a fear of letting people in and also letting yourself out. There is kind of this container that you're putting yourself in to remain sort of in control. And so sometimes that can lead to, again, like dryness or rigidity within the bedroom, or it can again lead to putting a lot of pressure of performance. Like, I have to be the best lover there ever was. So oftentimes what we see with this is that when there was some time when this person opened up, it became unsafe or it became complicated. So it was like they are showing themselves, they're opening up in childhood, and they suffered as a result. And that's just one particular instance, but usually there is some sort of consequence or negative association with opening up and vulnerability that can manifest in physical ways. So they can be scared of being messy, raw, and real. And so there's usually a lot of insecurities and inadequacy that you feel with this placement, and often a lot of fear as well, sometimes even a fear of death. So you can feel like you're not enough, which is very common with Saturn placements in general, but the 8th house is where we already have stored insecurities. And so Saturn here is like pushing on them, saying, no, you really should be insecure about this. You really aren't good at this. And so we can tend to kind of really pick on ourselves, at least in early life, until we learn how to value what we have to offer and to value emotional intimacy. And before we learn how to do that, we may resort to emotional isolation, which is similar with Saturn in the 4th house. We may kind of deny ourselves deep emotional connections with others. And this could be as a result of holding back emotionally or attracting partners who we know can't go as deeply as we can go. So it's like we are kind of setting ourselves up for not getting certain emotional needs met. So a denial of deep emotional connection and support in childhood often results in us then manifesting that later in life. The 8th house is also associated with our partner's resources. So if you do marry or end up in a long-term committed relationship, you may find that your partner, that you're taking on their debt, or that they are stingy in, spending on you, or that when you go to merge your finances, that matters become quite complicated. It's important to take issues around death, which is 8th house matters, very responsibly and very seriously. So this is like setting up a will, making sure that you have, everything that you need ready to go, so that if there is this end of life process, you don't have to complicate things, in general, and this could be for any of your family members as well, because the eighth house is also inheritance. So I could see, for example, someone being the likely person to inherit something, but then the person never set up a will, and so it gets super complicated and messy about where that goes, and how to divide assets. And I'm pretty sure that the government gets it, but regardless, there's a sense of struggle there, regarding that shared finances or the gifted finances or finances of others. So definitely be more careful when you are in relationships in terms of, splitting things at the bank or taking on a partner without knowing how much they make or how much they have in debt, because there may be sometimes things that creep up on you in an unfortunate way with this placement. Sometimes there can be emotional or physical abuse with this. This would really have to have probably more than just Saturn here, but that can be something that you may experience, especially if it's Saturn square Mars, or even Mars square Pluto in the chart somewhere. So there can just be this crisis that manifests as power struggles of abuse within childhood, or sometimes within adulthood as well. So there is probably a lot more I could say on that. Let me just check my notes and see if there's anything. Just maybe a fear of death, which is also prominent with Saturn in the 12th house. So I guess that's where I'm going to wrap that up. Now let's go ahead and cover Saturn in the 12th house. So Saturn in the 12th house, this is another challenging placement because 6th, 8th, and 12th houses are the most challenging houses in the zodiac or in the horoscope. So Saturn here can indicate sometimes depressive tendencies, feeling isolated, as I mentioned earlier, a fear of death. The 12th house is where we are connected to universal consciousness, to spirit, to life beyond the physical realm, to our understanding that we are one with all, that we belong to something outside of ourselves, which is a big deal for humans. So when we have Saturn, wherever we have Saturn, especially in any house that is thought or belief oriented, or even emotionally oriented, there can be a certain amount of skepticism and pessimism that befalls that house. It tends to do a little bit better in work-oriented houses. So, for example, the 12th house is where we have full faith and trust that the universe has our back, that we are belonging to something bigger than us, that God is here to support us. And these kind of universal cosmic truths that extend beyond humanity, really. And so Saturn here can really equate to having existential questions about life. And that's why I think there's a fear of death, because there's usually some desire to hold on or control wherever we have Saturn in our chart. Jesus, it's Mercury retrograde right now. And so what we can see with that is there's a desire to hold on or control things that are totally outside of our control. And this can result in quite a bit of fear. And what happens when we feel like we don't have the power to create change around us is depression, because we feel that our actions are not, like our will and our actions are not moving anything around us. And so we can have learned depression from that. And then again, the existential questioning of what is life? What's my part in life? Does God exist? What happens after death? And then being more so skeptic or pessimistic around that, it can make one fearful of death and things of that nature, because you don't know what's going to happen. It's not as easy to just believe what you want to believe, a supportive, life-enhancing belief. There is this dose of realism that can come in this placement that can make you uncertain. But I've also seen people with Saturn in the 12th house be extremely, extremely psychic, and very spiritually devoted. So it's not that these people are always going to be the skeptics and critics of spirituality and these universal truths. They may be huge supporters of them if they have found them to be true in their life, but there may also be this certain rigidity around them, which comes with Saturn, where we have maybe a specific way that we do things, and we have a really dedicated routine, which actually is very beneficial, like the healthy way to use Saturn in the 12th. I'm going to create a spiritual routine to meditate, take care of myself, connect with my guides, that type of thing. Or there can also be fear kind of linked up in it. Like I've known people who had Saturn in the 12th who were psychic, who had scary experiences as children seeing ghosts and, like seeing people in her room and being scared to fall asleep at night. So there can be like that connection to that other world, the connection to the spirit realm, but a fear around it as well, at least again in the early years of life, which is when Saturn tends to be its most negative for us. And as I mentioned, the 12th house is where we truly have to surrender our sense of control. It's things totally outside of us and outside of, honestly, the realm of the physical human world. And so whenever we have Saturn here, and especially if there's a transit activating that Saturn, we can feel this powerlessness at certain points of our lives. So sometimes this means that we have certain circumstances that actually take our power away and remove us from our daily life. So this is like somebody getting into a car accident, accidentally killing someone, and then having to go to jail. Or this is somebody getting sick and having to go to the hospital. I've seen this with Saturn moving into the 12th house. She didn't have this there natally, but it just transited through the 12th house and she wound up in the hospital. And so it's something that takes away our power, takes us away from our everyday place in life, can isolate us. And what it's doing in this kind of circumstance is it's ultimately trying to help us connect with our internal world and take that and connect it with the universal cosmic consciousness world or energy. So it's trying to move us from matter into energy, from thought into energy and feeling and intuition. And the best way to do that is to no longer inhabit your daily life, to no longer be in the same place, to no longer rely on your body in the same way. And so this can be done in a very challenging way, or it can be done in easier ways. Like, oh, I'm going to go to an ashram and I'm going to go live in this monastery and meditate for 10 hours a day, and just activate my own Saturn 12th house energy. I've noticed that people who do decide to use this for spirituality or, as I mentioned, kind of mystical practices, energetic practices, as well as healing or being of service to others, I notice that they tend to have a much easier time. Maybe it's because Saturn in their chart is more so reflected as a work planet or how they're of service to others than anything else. Or maybe that's just they choose to express it that way. And so the negative manifestations don't come as easily. And so there's essentially this benefit that you can have from doing karma of good service. And this is especially going to be true for 12th house matters related to people in hospitals or people who are isolated, people who are on like the outskirts of society who are not fully integrated. I'm thinking like addicts or people in mental health wards, things that are not in your typical kind of daily routine. Those kinds of jobs or being of service to those kinds of individuals will really help. Saturn is also a self-protecting energy. It's like Mars concerned with self-preservation. And so when it is in the 12th house, it can kind of lose and dissipate energy. And so it can be a little bit harder to protect oneself, or the normal defenses that we have can become ineffective, especially during a transit. And so this is why sometimes people might get, sent to the hospital or to prison or things like that, because maybe the ways in which we normally counteract that are not as effective for people with Saturn in the 12th house. There is usually a very strong fear around death, as I already mentioned, around being destroyed or being controlled. So there is some element of that powerlessness that there is a fear around. So however that manifests, whether it's in like a physical form or, being controlled in some way, emotionally. So there's just generally a fear of that. The 6th and 12th house axis can also indicate sacrifice. And so sometimes people with Saturn in the 12th house have a karma where they are sacrificing for somebody else. And this is where I think being of service can kind of help diminish this. But sometimes you get a really sick parent, or you grow up with a brother or sister that is, let's say like paralyzed, and then you have to do a lot to kind of sacrifice to take care of that person as you get older. And so they might be dedicating their lives to, again, people who can't do for themselves. So there's this sense of powerlessness coming in again, but it's almost like that person is powerless and then you have to step in and be responsible for them, which is very Saturn energy of responsibility. The 12th house is also in past lives can also be associated with very intense loss. So like all of a sudden losing all of your family or losing a home. And that's why there's usually this lingering fear of death and powerlessness, because there was usually some really big loss and crisis and huge kind of destroying effect in a past life that has lingered into this life and can make one just hold on to this fear. There can also be, sorry, I was just thinking about something and I feel like I just spaced out for a second. But there can also be guilt with Saturn in the 12th house. The 12th house, for some reason, it creates guilt. And so Saturn here is definitely like wearing a little bit of this albatross around your neck. And maybe it's because there is some past life karma that they're having to play out, or maybe not, but there can be feelings of guilt activated here. Sometimes also I've noticed that people in the 12th, Saturn in the 12th house may be very secretive and self-isolate or not share things with others. And they may have trouble also about even communicating what their life experiences are like. So it's not only that they don't share, but they also, when they do share, they may struggle to really get what they're trying to say across around their suffering, around their deep internal worlds. And so there can be a lot of like buried aspects of the self. And this is what I wanted to say. The 12th house is very subconscious as well. And it's an area of our life that we play out the planets in a very active way, but where we are not conscious of ourselves playing out those energies in our life. And so Saturn here is, again, where we can kind of undermine ourselves without realizing it. So, I want friends, and then you self-isolate. That's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. There can be almost like a self-sabotagey kind of energy where you maybe have a lot more potential, but there's some subconscious part of you that feels like it needs to limit itself, keep itself safe, control you, and not step outside of your comfort zone into the things that you really want. It might tell you like you can't have them or you don't deserve them. And again, all this could be entirely unconscious. So you could be making decisions in your life that are really countering what you desire and going against your concrete wishes within your mind. And you're like, well, why am I doing this? Why am I not living up to my potential? Why am I saying I want to work out and then I never work out? And it could be the Saturn in the 12th house is leading to the self-sabotage, because there is some part of your unconscious that has different desires or different beliefs that are operating against your conscious wishes. There can also be, just like, as I mentioned, there can be kind of karma built up here. So there may be some kind of debts that you have to pay to others. That could be any kind of thing, but that the sacrifice is kind of alluding to that. And there can also be just a lot of fear, as I mentioned, carried over within this lifetime. And that could be part of your subconscious drives without you realizing, how prominent fear actually is. And then lastly, the 12th house is this house of secrets. So it could be revealed if, Uranus moved through your 12th, or you had some certain aspects going on to Saturn in the 12th, there could be, or transiting aspects, there could be a revelation of hidden secrets that are painful, that were very much suppressed. So that is the 12th house. Let me just check one more time for my notes to see. I've also seen, like, for example, Beyonce has this. And I feel like, Saturn in the 12th, it's not that you can't be very successful. You're going to undermine yourself all the ways. But there can be just, I feel like what Beyonce experiences is, I can't just be friends with anyone. I can't just open up to anyone. I have to be really aware and in control of what's going on in my life. And so I feel like there may be an experience here for her where she basically doesn't have the full capacity to open up as, you know, the 12th house is a water-based house. It's Pisces ruled. So there is some kind of like emotional constriction that happens with any of these houses, 4th, 8th, and 12th. Also, I want to mention that sometimes discipline can be difficult because the 12th house is hidden from us and Saturn is our discipline. We can either be very disciplined or under disciplined. And we could also have trouble with anxiety and with addiction. And then also Saturn can be representative of our father. So sometimes the father can be missing or an addict or like just somehow emotionally or physically absent from our lives. Okay, there's honestly so much I could say, but I am going to stop there. The 12th house, I guess one more thing, the 12th house is very creative. So channeling not only the Saturn into our spiritual and service orientation practice, but also towards creativity is really helpful. Okay, now I'm going to wrap it up there. Let's go ahead and move on to the next set of houses. All right, so these next set of houses have to do with the earth signs. So the 2nd, 6th, and 10th house. And they are going to be related to earth qualities, which are practical matters, money, possessions, safety, security, lasting success, recognition, the material world, and all the things that we have to do to manifest those things, like developing skills, believing in ourselves, having confidence, and creating routine, dedication, all of those things we're going to talk about now. So let's go ahead and start off with the 2nd house, which is related to Taurus. So the 2nd house is our financial status. So having Saturn here can create issues around money. And again, I am going into the negative aspects of Saturn primarily in this video. So this is going to be all on a spectrum. For example, Taylor Swift has Saturn in the 12th house and she's like mega, mega rich. So even though there may be difficulties around money for her, they certainly do not show in her bank account. They may be coming up in a more private or internal way, but she has no trouble manifesting financial wealth. So keep that in mind. If you're like, I have Saturn in the 2nd house, am I not going to be wealthy? No, that's not necessarily the case, but that can be the case. That is a very literal example of this explanation. But that's not, again, it's going to vary depending on your personal chart. So if you want a reading, check me out in the link in the description box down below. So 2nd house, related to our sense of security, our financial wealth, our possessions, can create fear or lack around that with Saturn here. So there can be a fear of poverty, and this feeling like, especially if you did grow up in childhood, if you did grow up in childhood impoverished, there is this fear oftentimes around that coming back. So I am going to work super, super hard to never have to be poor again. And I actually know that Taylor Swift grew up pretty wealthy, so that was definitely not a thing for her. But this can be, you know, your self-made millionaires, these people who have learned that through hard work and grit and determination, you can earn your way in society, you can become successful, you can become rich, and then they become extremely self-reliant. And that's very much a 2nd house matter, is our sense of self-reliance. Am I not going to be essentially vulnerable or dependent on others for survival and for things that I need? And so people with Saturn here, because Saturn is a planet that likes to control, they will become maybe overly self-reliant. And so this can be driven maybe by a sense of fear, but there is part of them that's working out some karma where they need to be self-reliant, where they need to maybe be the one to take care of others rather than to be taken care of. And maybe this can relate to some kind of past life where they stole from people or where they didn't work hard enough. And so now they have to kind of earn their way in the world. That might not be the case, but that is a possibility. Sometimes they can also overly rely on others here because Saturn does lead to an exaggeration or an underdevelopment at times of certain energies. And so if it's underdeveloped, you may never learn to be self-reliant. You may overly depend on others and become almost like a nuisance or a burden in other people's lives. And this is usually because there is a sense of poverty within the individual, because the second house, while it manifests externally, is of course reflective of internal processes related to our own worthiness. And so I'm going to attract the level of worthiness that I believe I deserve, that I believe my value is. And so if you feel like you're looking at the glass half empty and you're not good enough, then you're going to attract people, circumstances, opportunities that reflect that level of self-worth that you believe you have. Sometimes these children did not grow up in poverty. In fact, they grew up like Taylor Swift, where they were definitely well off, but maybe they felt like there wasn't a positive modeling for self-confidence. Maybe the mom would always talk about how she looked and how she was nitpicking aspects of herself. Or maybe the parents were overly focused on the material world and didn't focus enough on her, internal world. And so there can be like an unhealthy relationship with what brings our sense of value to the world. Is it me, or is it the stuff I own? Is it me, or is it my money? And you can have to kind of learn these things in a healthy, proper way with Saturn in the second house. Sometimes also the Saturn can be quite strict. And so, like I said, with Saturn in the 12th, we can be very, interested in the spiritual world. We can come up with a very strong routine around that, be disciplined around that. With Saturn in the second house, sometimes we can be overly austere. We're like, okay, I'm not going to be wealthy. Wealth is bad. Wealth is the reason for all the suffering in the world and my suffering. So I'm going to make sure to deny myself the material comforts of the world, and I'm going to purify myself this way. And that can also sometimes be with Saturn in the 12th house, but it's especially true for the second in terms of financial success. And so there can be this desire to kind of, again, be more austere out of fear around money. It's all developing a fear or insecurity around money and self-worth and value. So it's like this can manifest in a number of ways, and I'm just kind of listing them out. Money can be a source of insecurity in general. So people like having to prove themselves, like bragging to you, for example, or even sometimes being greedy or having guilt or shame around money. And so there is just this whole journey around the discovery of your value and some consistency and stability around your financial success. Generally, they may feel like they have to work very hard to earn money. It's not like it just flows to them without any effort. This will depend on the rest of your chart, please. It will depend on that. But there's usually some kind of internal obstacle to success, like being overly critical of yourself, having self-doubt, all the things that I've mentioned. It's like you may have to work hard, but it's usually because you're like pushing a log up a hill. And the hill is all of your internal dialogue that is against you. And so you may actually have to work harder because of that. Sometimes these people will also really want to collect things. So I want to have a lot of houses. I want to have a lot of money. I want to have a lot of clothes or cars or shoes or phones because I want to feel safe. And Saturn, wherever we have Saturn, there is a fear and a lack mentality. And so being in this area of possessions and money, we might naturally start to accumulate more and more and more because we don't ever want to run out. We always want to feel super safe, like we're in a padded little bubble, like we have everything that we need. And so we might just almost like not know when to stop the accumulation or even why we want the certain things that we want and maybe not realize it's from a place of fear. The second house is ruled by Taurus. So there is a rigidity and a stubbornness here, which can help you reach success, but can be difficult in times where adaptability, vulnerability, and reliance on others is key or beneficial. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to add. Managing your money is going to be very important too. So making sure, for example, Saturn's retrograde, to not be taken advantage of, to develop wisdom around what to do with finances once you actually start making money. So if you do work very, very hard, then what are you going to do with it? Like, you can't just let the responsibility end there. How you use the money, manage it, give to others, all those things become really important parts of your karma in this lifetime. And this oftentimes can indicate that when you do work hard, you may have money long term. So while Saturn can lead to restrictions and having less of something, it can also mean that once you've mastered it, it's almost like it's there to stay. It's not just going to leave because you've mastered how to make money. So even if it for some reason left, you could make it again. And so there is this notion that you can create a long-term stability for yourself if you are doing things the mature, disciplined, right way. So that is what I'm seeing for Saturn in the second. Let's go ahead and move on to Saturn in the sixth house. All right, up next we have the sixth house, which is Virgo energy. So Saturn in the sixth house is actually the placement that I have. And as I mentioned, the sixth house is one of the more challenging houses. And so you can really see some issues arise, particularly around mental or physical health. However, the sixth house is probably the least of the bad houses for Saturn because it is also associated with work, discipline, working under someone, and Saturn already likes those significations. It already understands those. It knows how to work with those. So it's not that bad. So there can be some difficulties, but there also are some benefits from it as well. So the sixth house has a lot to do with our routine. It's kind of how we get up in the morning, how we take care of our health, eat our foods, basically how we establish a consistent kind of dedicated practice to our daily lives. And so Saturn here can create delays or difficulties around that. So maybe during childhood, you lacked a routine, or maybe the routine did not during childhood suit your personality and suit kind of what your needs were at the time. So there can be a general difficulty and delay in creating order within one's life, creating that kind of consistency. And this will also go in terms of taking care of your health as well. So you may either have to overcome some hurdles and have delays in learning how to properly take care of your health, especially the mind-body connection, which the sixth house is very much akin to. You may have a little bit of difficulty in those areas of your life, or you may have a certain challenge come into your life that forces you to actually pay even more attention and energy to your health. So for example, I have scoliosis. It's not just any old scoliosis. I had a back surgery and put rods and screws, and now I have screws that are coming loose. And so I have to be very mindful of my body. I am always doing yoga. I am very much aware of, what I can and can't do physically. And so it just leads me to a lot more cautiousness and restrictiveness around my health, which is what Saturn in the sixth house can do. The sixth house, having Saturn here, can mean that there is almost like a disconnection about how the part is very much informed by the whole or is part of a whole system. And so there can be almost like a disconnection from the greater needs of the system. So for example, let's say Saturn in the sixth, you have, a routine where you make sure you brush your teeth every night, but your mental health isn't doing well. So it's like you are kind of checking off the very mundane and physical aspect of taking care of yourself, but there are deeper systemic issues going on that lead you to feeling depressed or anxious or whatever it is. And so Saturn here is asking you to dig deeper and work harder to see those connections and to establish basically a relationship with the whole system and work on creating routine and functioning within the whole system and being very consistent and dedicated and disciplined to maintain that routine for the system. So this can be your physical system, the system within your work, the system within just how you manage your time and your energy, but there is like a dedication to that area of your life, and you may have certain difficulties in trying to establish that kind of routine. So I see oftentimes that this is related to workaholism or overworking, because the sixth house is where we become disciplined, show up to our job every day, do the tasks that we're meant to do, be of service to people, work in a group. And so sometimes we may be a little bit overzealous. We are like, okay, I'm not doing good enough. I'm not good enough as a person. I don't work hard enough. And you kind of work yourself to the bone. So wherever Saturn is, there's insecurity. And the sixth house is also full of insecurity. So this can make one very anxious because there can be a high degree of being overly self-critical, feeling like you're never really measuring up, and especially within the workplace, that can lead to this kind of overworking tendency. So it's really important for these individuals to learn how to balance self-care, their own nurturing, like taking care of the whole system and not, again, just part of their lives, not just the workplace, but themselves as a whole. It's also important for these individuals to learn how to value their own work and their own efforts. And they may find out that, like, when working within an existing system, so when working with coworkers and things of that nature, they may find out that they will take on actually more burden than they need to. So for example, like coworkers around them may feel their incompetence, and they may be like, okay, I'm gonna pick up the slack for Jimmy over here, who's always high and not really caring. So that would be an example. Or having people take advantage of them, especially if Saturn is retrograde, and say, you know, I want you to do all these tasks, and you have a boss that never stops loading on your plate, and they don't know how long things take, and then they just kind of keep piling it on. So there's a need to really value oneself, to value one's effort and dedication and work and routine, and to have like boundaries and structures around that. So I will, do this thing to protect the system, to protect myself. And that includes me honoring my efforts. That includes me knowing when to stop and when to say no, to taking on more responsibility, because the sixth house is where we actually have, we're of service to others, but we're in, back in the day, it was associated with slavery. So Saturn here is being controlled, like almost being like a little slave for somebody else. Obviously in more modern day kind of terms, but there is a sense of having to really sacrifice and do for others when you maybe need more boundaries. So I mentioned the 6th and 12th house both can have this kind of sacrificing energy, where you may have to like take care of a sick partner or a parent or child or something like that. So those are both potentials. You may be interested in service-oriented fields, especially concerning medicine or the physical health or mental health. So I see a lot of healers who have predominant 6th house placements who are interested in that type of thing, but there can be just service businesses in general. You may also be a leader within the workplace because Saturn does take on more responsibility. It is respected or dignified in this area of the chart. And so people will kind of look up to you, your coworkers will see you as being someone that they can really rely on and trust and give stuff to and know that it's going to be done well. And so that lends itself to becoming more of a leader. But this is the 6th house, which is about working for a company. So it's not necessarily going to imply that you're a leader at a huge corporation or have your own business. That will depend on the rest of your chart. But you could be almost like a leader amongst peers, or have like a lower leadership position, if that makes sense. Not something like really, really high up, like the main manager or the main owner, but something kind of intermediary. You may also experience issues with coworkers. As I mentioned, the coworkers might give you too much of their work. They might overly rely on you or overly burden you. They may also just have difficult relationships with you. So you might not just get along with them. You might not like them. That's also common with this. You may also resent the people around you or your workplace because you might feel overworked, underpaid, underappreciated. But again, this will really vary depending on the aspects. Like I mentioned, I have this placement and I have a sextile to Venus. So I've never had a job where I felt like I was underpaid or underappreciated. I mean, who wouldn't want to get paid more? But there was never the sense I was being taken advantage of. So this will largely depend on what you have in the rest of your chart. But that is what I'm seeing for the 6th house. Let me just see if there's anything else in my notes. Adverse health conditions in childhood, which I already kind of mentioned. Having to put a lot more effort to avoid illness, especially in the long run. having that work-life balance. And you may be prone to perfectionism, which can lead to anxiety and mental health issues. So I already kind of mentioned those things, but really honing in on the perfectionism, giving yourself a lot more credit for the work that you do, the value that you provide to others is going to be very beneficial as an antidote to this. So I hope that that resonates. Let's go ahead and move on to the next earth sign, which is 10th house, Capricorn. Okay, Saturn in the 10th house, aka Capricorn sign, is good and challenging that I have seen. So I have seen people become very successful because the 10th house is the area associated with career. It's our notability in the world, our reputation, basically how we make an impact on our community. And so having Saturn here can, again, lead people to consider you as somebody who is an authority figure, as somebody who they should look up to and who should lead them and who should have responsibility within the community or within your business or company or whatever it is. There is some level of control usually that you will have with Saturn in the 10th house. And so this can make it really good for reaching long-term success and just building something that is of legacy almost for the next generation. However, there's always this feeling with Saturn in the 10th house that you are behind. The feeling that you're not doing good enough is always really common with Saturn. And then kind of couple that with the fact that your career is a very external thing. It's a very notable thing about, someone in their life. And so if you feel like you're not where you want to be, you can almost very easily compare yourself to others and see, okay, I'm not at this stage in my life yet, and they already are. So as with Saturn always does, it can make us feel like we are just not doing enough. And so we can really push ourselves to work very, very, very hard to achieve our goals. We can also over-identify with these goals, and we might even sacrifice areas of our life or ourselves to achieve these things. And the 10th house is not even just your career, but it's also what you want out of life. And oftentimes it is associated with the mother in the chart. That's not always the case, but many times the 10th house is representative of the mother. And so sometimes having Saturn here could maybe indicate a cold mom or a hardworking mom, one that you don't necessarily feel like there is this warmth or this caringness, this nurturing there. So it can have a somewhat similar effect to Saturn in the 4th house. And actually, I know somebody who has this who did have a strained relationship with her mother. And so I think this is just a great example of how we can sometimes have really hard childhoods and not get certain emotional needs met when we're growing up. And then we can then put so much emphasis on the external world as we grow up. And now I need to reach success. Now I need to reach security. And it's almost like we're trying to give ourselves something that we didn't have in childhood, but in a different form. And so I'd be curious to see if that resonated with some of you who have Saturn in the 10th. So you can over-identify with work, sacrifice too much with it, which means that if you aren't doing well, it says something about you as a person, and it can really bring down your sense of confidence, which is really unfair because sometimes there is an association with effort and outcomes, but sometimes there isn't. We can put a lot of effort and the outcome doesn't result in what we think. And that can make it mean something about us when it really doesn't. And so it's important to kind of tease those apart and work on this self-concept as we get older if you have this. Usually what I see with Saturn in the 10th house is that there is a strong ambition, a strong drive, a strong discipline, and it's also honed through time because it usually takes quite a lot of time to reach this phase of success in your life. It's usually the people who are achieving kind of their dreams or their goals more in their late 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And they're like, why am I so behind? Why did it take me this long? And it's just because that's part of your chart. It's just part of maybe what you're meant to experience. And sometimes Saturn in the 10th house can also have issues with authority. So maybe it takes them some time to kind of gain their own authority over their life. Maybe it doesn't. It will really depend on the person. But sometimes that can also take part in the delay. The 10th house is where we kind of have to bend to society's rules, or a rule of an organization or of a parent, basically authority figures. And so Saturn here can create strife where we're like, I don't get along. I don't get along with this authority figure. I have a challenging relationship with them, oftentimes the mother as well, or sometimes the father. And so it can, again, create a little bit of this weird dynamic where you almost need to have your own liberty, your own freedom within the company. You need to have like a higher up role, because they doesn't tend to do well. Like, you don't tend to do well taking orders or dealing with certain authority figures, because it's very likely that in your childhood that there was a parent that took advantage of that authority, and there can be some mistrust or fear around people in authority now as a result of those childhood experiences. Sometimes it can also create challenges in the role regarding women and femininity in general, because the 10th house can be associated with the mother. So there can be almost like a fear of the feminine, or a fear of stepping into a feminine role. Like, for example, if you're ever going to be like a stay-at-home mom, I feel like that just wouldn't really vibe very well with this kind of placement. Of course, depending on the rest of the chart, but that can bring about this pushing away of that kind of idea or potential. There can also be a huge sensitivity to the public opinion. So the 10th house is the public. It is the most visible part of the chart, where the sun is at 12 o'clock. And so we have Saturn here, which is indicating that there is like some kind of karma where we're afraid of being hurt, because maybe in a past life we were hurt, actually, in a public opinion. Maybe we shared something or did something and became ostracized as a result, or ridiculed. And so we are more sensitive to that. And so if you have this placement, you might be a little bit more scared to be a public face or put yourself out there in some extent because of this. They often need to feel important, because the 10th house is our reputation, and Saturn likes to take things very seriously. So there is like this seriousness around, I want to be considered, trustworthy. I want to be considered somebody who really honors their duty. I want to have some social prestige or status. Maybe I want to marry somebody who has status, for example. And there is a search for this in life to also kind of concretize the self-esteem. So it's looking for validation externally through these kind of public, self-reflections. Inadequacy is often not present also in one-to-one relationships as much as it is in larger contexts, which I found super interesting. So it's not necessarily that you'll see this desire for like prominence within a dynamic. It's really just them interacting with the world where this becomes very prominent and very obvious. Sometimes they can be conservative or slow to make decisions around their career. So not wanting to kind of leap into the next new thing, not wanting to take certain risks or chances, but wanting to do things by the book, wanting to take time, make slow adjustments and changes. Those tend to be the way that you will go. But then, of course, if you have certain transits going on, or, your midlife crisis where Uranus opposition occurs, this could totally change. So it's really going to depend on where you're at in your life. So the great part about this, though, is that they tend to be very, very persistent until they reach success. So it's like they're not going to give up. And it's largely because there is a little bit of fear-driven inadequacy going on here, where if I don't achieve success, it means something about me, because their identity is linked with their career. So they're very, very persistent. Like, I will not give up, which is very amazing, very beautiful. But again, it's really built on this fear of failure. Like, I cannot fail, because if I fail, it means XYZ. And so there is just this kind of almost like irrational, maybe even unconscious fear that they're just going to fail, or they're not doing good enough. And it can make things sometimes harder to start. So this kind of informs that conservative approach. Well, if I don't take chances, if I don't take as many risks, then I won't fail, and I will, I will reach my destination, I will reach success, but it might take me longer. but I won't fail. I'll prevent myself from having to have that negative emotional experience. So it's very interesting to consider that. And in general, these are going to be people who may be seen as authority. They take on a lot of responsibility. So they could be your public figures. They could be people who are politicians who are taking on responsibility of the community and who you look up to. And so, yeah, those are all things that you might consider. Just know if you have this placement that success is likely to come, but just kind of unwinding the personality from the external world and external validation is going to be really beneficial. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to all of the air signs, which is going to be 3rd, 7th, and 11th house. Okay, Saturn in the air houses. Gemini, Libra, Aquarius, 3rd, 7th, 11th houses. So air signs are associated with communication. So communicative expression, connection between others, sharing ideas or having ideas, understanding things, learning about things, belonging to associations. All of those are air sign topics. So let's go ahead and start off with the 3rd house. Saturn in the 3rd house can represent difficulty in early childhood education. The 3rd house are our kind of younger primary school years and kindergarten, all those things. So if you ever got held back, if you ever had a really strict teacher or didn't do well socializing with the other kids, maybe you had a learning disability but didn't know yet, maybe some of the kids bullied you, or maybe you had an older sibling that was really smart and you compared yourself to them, there is usually some kind of way that we start to move around our environment. The 3rd house is where we start to develop like motor skills, moving, interacting, learning, sharing our ideas, kind of experimental phase of our childhood. And there is some kind of like limitation in this stage of your life. So maybe you could have parents that try to prevent you from going out and exploring all those contexts. Maybe they wanted to keep you safe, or they had some kind of fear wrapped up in you exploring your environment around you, interacting with your environment around you. Maybe you could finally see your peers, see your local neighborhood, see, the people in your classroom, and compare yourself and see that there are maybe some ways in which you feel you don't add up. And this is when the inadequacy can start to creep in of, I'm not learning quick enough. I'm not communicating well enough. People aren't understanding me. I'm trying to say something and they're not getting it, but my friend Billy says something and they get what he says. What's different with me? What's wrong with me? And so you can start to kind of compartmentalize or imagine maybe parts of yourself that are less than perfect. And this is a very young age. This is probably like, I don't know, probably around like 5 years old is when this starts. I need to look back at my book. I'm not really great with like children and development. But essentially this is when we start to kind of get out there and see what's outside of us. And so we can start to see where we don't measure up or where we're not succeeding in interacting with this environment or learning this thing or moving on to school. The comparison game becomes strong. Because this is an area associated with communication and ideas, many people will develop speech impediments or, like I said, have some kind of learning disability or be behind in school. And usually this is not indicating that they aren't going to be intelligent or really good at communicating. It just usually indicates that there's some early childhood indicator or issue around delays of development. And again, this does not mean that the outcome as an adult will be impacted by those early delays. It just means that there are delays. So maybe you got held back in kindergarten and you always kind of felt behind, and it develops into a sense of inadequacy, but actually you're very intelligent, you go on to get a master's degree, all those things are possible. And so don't use this as a sign that you're not smart, because that's definitely not the case. For example, Steve Jobs has this, and I think it just can indicate that you may take things very seriously when it comes to education, and you may have to work harder than other people. And so I think that maybe that was Steve's experience. So they are often very studious, as I mentioned. And I think Steve Jobs had difficult relationships and maybe wasn't the best communicator. And I think he may have even had some kind of learning disability or speech impediment growing up, but I can't remember which one or what it was exactly. Let me see if I have it in my other notes. Um, yeah, I can't remember, but essentially what it later indicates is that you have mastered the art of communication and learning. Even though there was those initial delays, you typically go on and master it, and you can actually become really great teachers as a result. Or maybe you just take this area of your life very seriously and you want to teach others. You take communication very seriously and responsibly, and you want to make work out of it. So you don't always have to have hardships to overcome, but usually that is the case. It's just how Saturn is. So people with Saturn in the third can have really great concentration and depth of thought. So they are not going to really be an ADHD kind of squirrel brain child as much as they will be maybe intensely focused on what they're doing. Again, this will be dependent on the rest of your chart, but it can indicate quite a bit of intelligence, even though it can also indicate things that they have to overcome when learning. They can be very well spoken, and they can also be very good at writing, or again, they can have trouble with these areas of their life and feel like they're falling behind. The sad part is, even if they are well spoken, they can always feel like they're not smart enough. They can always feel like they're going to be silly or say the wrong thing, or that they're foolish, or they're not doing enough, or they especially don't know enough. And so this is a very common thing with Saturn in the third house, is the feeling of being behind, particularly in mental activities. Like, I just haven't learned enough, or I'm just not developed enough as everyone around me. And it could be totally false. They could be way more hardworking and smarter than people around them. They tend to be tactful and diplomatic, like a politician, or they can have strained relationships through communication as a result of Saturn. They may be a quiet type or reserved, since it has a lot to do with how we're interacting with our environment. They might be conservative or slow to take those steps forward. They might, again, have had parents that didn't want them to, or discourage them to, or criticize them in their way that they interacted with their environment. And so as a result, they might kind of take the back seat or be a little bit more reserved. If they fear the unknown, they can become stubborn and dogmatic in their belief systems, because the third and the ninth house axis kind of play off of each other. So if they are not exploring their environment as a child, if the parents are telling them to fear it, or telling them they're not good enough to be out there interacting with it, then they can start to develop certain ideas about the world that are not based off of truth, that are based off of fear, and then they become kind of solidified in that. So it can develop even more fear. So that's not going to be the case for everyone, but some people may have that. And if they are they can also be truth-oriented and desire depth and certainty. So if they are not fearful of their environment, they are going out and trying to discover what is true about it. So if they're going out into pre-K and they're learning about, what it's like to be at school for the first time, and learning how to develop relationships with fellow children, and learning how to paint and do all these things that they've never tried before, they can be fearful and kind of reserved, or they can be wanting to be perfectionistic, do it the best, wanting to find the right way, the truth of the matter, as I mentioned, like what is like the underlying truth in this scenario. And again, there is like a desire for certainty, as I mentioned. So if I keep reacting to my environment this way, am I going to keep getting the result? And there's something that can be kind of satisfying for people with Saturn here in the third house that have that. And then they may be prone to accidents while driving, walking, especially driving. So just be careful with that. And then definitely relationships with siblings can be very challenging. They might be cold. They might be something that you take very seriously, and you're very committed to those relationships, or you're responsible for taking care of your siblings in some way, because that's what the third house rules. So I've seen somebody have Saturn, I don't know, I think they had natal Saturn in the third house, and then they had Pluto transiting over that natal Saturn, if I remember correctly. So there's some challenging planet transiting over it. And for that period of time, like those few years, those sisters used to be really close and dedicated to each other. And then they just completely stopped talking. And it was kind of this natal promise. Like they were always close, but then Saturn in the third house does indicate a potential for hardships in your sibling relationships. And it wasn't until they were both way into their adulthood and she experienced a transit that it activated this natal promise of having a struggle with this sister, with this sibling. And so you can kind of see that come into play in childhood or maybe even later on down the line. And just generally, there can be a lot of insecurities around not knowing enough, not communicating well enough, and not being as good as your sibling or having an issue with your sibling. So that is usually what I see with Saturn in the third house. Let's go ahead and move on to Saturn in the seventh house, also associated with Libra. All right, Saturn in the seventh house. My favorite. Just kidding. This can be a little bit of a challenging one. It doesn't have to be. Again, there are so many things that can manifest, but this is a very strong relationship house. And so whenever we have Saturn in a relationship area, it's just going to usually bring a lot more life lessons around the people that we choose to hook up with, relate to, connect to, love, be vulnerable with. And that's a hard thing to have lessons around. So Saturn in the seventh house, there's so much I have to say. First of all, the seventh house is a projected house. It is the house in our chart that we least identify with, that we are looking for something of that nature in a partner. So let's say I'm a Virgo rising, which I am. That means I have Pisces in my seventh house. So I tend to attract Pisces into my life. That's not always the case, but they can have Piscean qualities, strong Neptune, or they're just literally a Pisces. And it's almost like I see something in them that I have not fully owned and expressed. And as a result, I am finding that they complete me in some way. And the more that we kind of own our full selves and the rejected part of ourselves, or the kind of unseen or underdeveloped part of ourselves, the more that this becomes less of a thing. But generally, that's what's happening with our seventh house. So any planets in the seventh house will also indicate that. So sometimes Saturn is something that you maybe struggle with yourself, that you actually look for within a partner. So maybe somebody who's extremely disciplined, very hardworking. There can also be like the negative sides of Saturn, that there is a part of you that is somehow manifesting a partner that is colder or more distant or very critical. Saturn is also related to age. So we can attract somebody who's much older, much younger to ourselves. This is so common. So common. I see this all the time. People with 28, 10-year age differences with Saturn in the seventh house. And it doesn't matter who's older, who's younger. It really doesn't. And so you'll find that the partner more easily expresses your Saturn than you do. That's usually how it goes. And then as we kind of evolve in consciousness, it can change. So again, a hardworking partner, a critical partner, and sometimes a partner who is dependent on us or who takes care of us. So it can go either way. Saturn can be a source of burden and requiring a lot of our energy. So they're needy. And so we can feel like, relationships are so much work. There's so much responsibility. And it's because oftentimes you attract people that you have to actually take care of. And so you kind of take on more responsibility than maybe the average person does. And it's because of some kind of karma playing out there. There may also be karmic relationships, people that you've hurt in past lives or that have just come back around for some unfinished business of some sort, some lessons that you need to learn from people. We all have karmic relationships, but they are much more likely to be prominent or longer or more important for someone with Saturn in the seventh house. They're kind of having to go through some BS usually first before experiencing the learned lessons and the gold that can be at the other side of this. And so some of the BS that they might go through is being in relationships where their partner is possessive, controlling, critical, demanding, limiting, restricting, unfaithful, cold, hurtful. So kind of harsh for relationships, right? Not really something that you want to experience. So those are some of the negative aspects that you can have. So it's usually you're going to at some point in your life attract a painful situation or rejection in relationships. And this is usually because you need to learn how to express your own self-worth, your own maybe hard work ethic. That's not going to be true for everyone. Your own boundaries. Super, super important. Saturn doesn't necessarily represent the boundaries itself, but it is a structural type of element. So whenever we have a hurt Saturn, we tend to have flexible boundaries. We tend to have issues around boundaries. So Saturn in the 7th can indicate that we may attract partners that will test and push on those boundaries until we learn how to become solid and stronger within ourselves and define what we really need in a relationship. And sometimes this also means that we could be the Saturn, that we could attract partners who have weak boundaries, that we could be the overly dominant ones or the ones who have to always be right or have to always get their way or, whatever. It's like the dominance is a factor within the relationship, like who wears the pants, who gets to control. And so sometimes that could be us, sometimes it could be them, depending on who we are in our chart. But there's usually some kind of manifestation of unhealthy boundaries, whether we're trampling on other people's boundaries or we don't have a strong sense of boundaries on our own. So the boundaries are meant to be developed to help us learn how to express our needs, our wants, and our self-worth within the relationship. And I don't know a lot about Jennifer Lopez, but I do know that she has had some relationship stuff going on. And she has finally gone back to Ben Affleck, I think. And just, she's a little bit older. She's had a lot of career success, but relationships tend to be that area of her life where things are just kind of not working out. Like she got engaged, they broke it off. I think she has a kid. It's I don't even know her relationship history. I just know that it doesn't have the traditional easy kind of success label attached to it. And so that can be very typical of Saturn in the 7th house, which is what she has, where you might not find the fruits of your labor in relationships till much later in life. You might not find your partner. You might prioritize work or responsibilities before your partner, or you might just have so many lessons that you have to learn and kind of things that you have to go through first before you find the right person or are adept enough to settle within a relationship and be healthy on both ends with the people you attract, how you behave, and just, everything across the board. So if you are still in the phase of learning about relationships, you might find that you have a partner that is not really worth investing in or isn't very committal and you don't really want to commit to them. And this is often the case because there can be a fear around commitment to a partner because there is usually this association with partnership and hard work and these lessons that you may kind of either have experienced or inherently feel from a past life or just naturally. You kind of expect certain hardships around relationships. And so there can be a fear around actually committing to somebody, and how that manifests is maybe you choosing a partner that again won't commit to you, that that you're not a match with, that it's not going to work out, and you just kind of go into that anyway because it's almost like ensuring that you won't progress. It's almost ensuring that things won't become very serious or that you can remain somehow detached and not have to overcomplicate your life. And so you may be avoiding commitment that way. Essentially, there can be an avoidance of true love and vulnerability here with Saturn in the 8th house. Maybe attracting or being with someone that doesn't have the emotional depth that you have, kind of like we were talking about with Saturn in the 8th. It's almost like committing yourself to somebody who isn't as deep as you, so you'll never get to that level of attachment and vulnerability. So you can't be hurt on that level. Once they learn how to create stability within themselves and not through a partnership, they attract much better partners. So usually, as I mentioned, Saturn is the projected aspect of you when it's in the 7th house. So we need to learn how to reintegrate our Saturn, which is our boundaries that again honor our needs, wants, and self-worth. The other aspect of Saturn is creating that consistency and discipline and structure and stability. This might not be in your work career. This might be internally as an individual. I'm okay on my own. I don't need a partner. And not just like, I don't need someone in this kind of rejected fashion, but I actually am filling up my cup. I'm feeling very emotionally fulfilled. I'm having beautiful relationships. I am stable and strong on my own, and I will now attract partners that reflect that. So that is kind of the longer life journey of someone with Saturn in the seventh house. And so, again, it might be that later on, that later in life you settle down. That might take you a little bit longer than people around you to find your person, but it's usually going to be well worth it. So it's going to be something that gets better with age. If you do have work where you have one-on-one clients, like if you're a therapist, for example, you may also notice that people are very dependent on you or needy, or you have struggles within those relationships, because the seventh house also has to do with one-on-one dynamics as well as contracts. So also maybe just be a little bit more careful around signing contracts and things of that nature, because you may have some stumbling blocks to overcome in that process. So that is Saturn in the seventh house. Let's take a look at it in the 11th house. Okay, Saturn in the 11th house. So this one can be chill, or this one can be quite difficult. And just like any of them, it depends on your chart, the placements, the aspects, everything like that. For example, a chill version of this I have seen when it comes to friendships and community, which is what the 11th house stands for, is somebody who had a friend that was judgmental of her, slightly critical of her, and she took some time to realize it and then later just decided not to be her friend. A more intense example of this would be Elon Musk or Megan Fox, who kind of had whole communities turn against them. So I know that they maybe both struggled in some ways with their individuality in some respects, because the 11th house is where we are individual, but also part of a group. And so sometimes there can be that struggle with that polarity, essentially. And I know that Elon, as a child, had a friend that lured him into this area where people like attacked him or bullied him in some way. So he had a friend that he deemed trustworthy, and that friend turned on him or used him for, pain and manipulation. So this can be Saturn in the 11th house. That's a very intense version, but it's just where you may have basically bad luck in areas of friendships. And so sometimes this can result in you having very few friends that you really trust, like a very small circle of people that you rely on, because these bad experiences can make you feel like, no, these people are going to hurt me. I can't trust them. I have fear around them. And it can also create fear around trying to belong, or like trying to go to parties or be in this group or fit into this atmosphere. It can create fear around that, like, oh, I don't fit in here. I feel weird. I feel like the outlier. I feel like they're going to find me out. I feel like they're going to see that I'm an imposter. And so there can be this feeling there around belonging, that you never truly, truly belong. And that can be really challenging. And so this is, again, very common with people who are criticized, bullied, or ignored by people that they want to connect to. And so that can manifest as then becoming a little bit more of a lone wolf. And we can see that again with Megan Fox. Like, she blew up in the media, and then she kind of got hated on and bashed on and then disappeared for a while. And so I feel like this was enacting her Saturn 11th house of, I was rising to prominence, and then I get attacked by my community, and then I now don't trust people. Maybe I'm more private, or I just don't have as many people in my life. So you can have a loneliness that comes from feeling like you can't be yourself in groups as well. So maybe you are present in these groups, but you have to pretend, you have to put on a face. You are not maybe fully accepted for who you are. And so that's that polarity again with individuality versus group and group think and belonging. And so you may feel like, oh, if I want to belong, if I have to like match what people are doing, and it might feel inauthentic to you. And so you might truly feel alone in a crowded room. They often separate themselves from the group as well, creating a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And they may feel just awkward if they are in a group. They may feel like they lack social graces, or they don't understand others very easily. And again, they are not understood very easily. So there's like this mix. Their own individuality is just not blending with the group individuality or the group essence. And so it's either they have to pretend, or they feel like they're always being missed in some way. And again, it kind of creates more mistrust around relationships, and then pulling back even more. So there is a need for them to honor and accept their uniqueness, while not trying to artificially puff themselves up, while not trying to be superior or better or more unique, but to honor who they really are, and also not to hide who they really are. So you don't want to go into extremes on either direction, which Saturn can sometimes do. And if your differences are not accepted, you can bulldoze yourself for desire to belong and lose your own inner voice, which is what I already talked about. So there is also something else here that's important, which the 11th house is not just your friendships and community. It's the whole idea of humanitarian efforts, something beyond yourself, something that is future oriented, is going to help other generations, other types of people that are not necessarily right next to you. So those with Saturn in the 11th have a sort of karmic responsibility towards the earth, towards these generations, towards the future, towards other types of people, to be of service to them, to do something for them, to have a purpose that will ultimately benefit them in the long run, benefit others outside of them in the long run. And so without this kind of purpose, without something bigger than they are, they may feel like they are lost. They may feel like they are rudderless. And again, this is Elon Musk. He was bullied. He had difficulty with friends in childhood, but then he got this bigger mission of, I'm going to help save the planet. I'm going to help us, conquer Mars and populate Mars, or whatever his goals are, something to help society move forward. And now all this energy of Saturn in the 11th is being driven towards something outside of him, towards something bigger than him. And it allows him to be successful and to utilize the positive manifestations here. Saturn in the 11th house can also indicate you being very disciplined in networking with others. So the 11th house is where we kind of go and find benefactors, find people that can lift us up in society, or who can market us, or just maybe they have achieved something that we haven't yet and they're helping us along the way. So Saturn here can maybe indicate finding a mentor or working really hard to create those connections. So it can indicate success there, but really hard-earned success, or maybe even struggling in that particular area. The 11th house, as I mentioned, is our friend group. So sometimes Saturn as a leadership planet can also be associated with being seen as being the responsible one in the friend group, or people looking up to you and relying on you as a friend. So them kind of needing you and really trusting that you are, again, the responsible one. So overall, it's common to fear to not be accepted in society or within your friend groups, as I've already mentioned. And they tend to gravitate towards fewer people. They are deeply loyal to those who are close to them. That's also super important. They do have kind of a fear around these relationships, but once they have realized that they can trust you, they will open up deeply and rely on you and become very, very loyal and dedicated to you. So it is a beautiful placement once you overcome the hardships. So that is all I have for Saturn in the 11th house. Let's go ahead and move on to the last element, which are the fire signs. So the first house, Aries, 5th house, Leo, 9th house, Sagittarius. Okay, so Saturn in the first house. Actually, let's rewind. Fire signs in general have to do with will, self-realization, personal expression, passion, beliefs, desires. So it's a lot about the self and really representing the self in unbridled way. So Saturn in the first house, this is probably the most challenging placement for Saturn, in my opinion. The first, fourth, and 8th house, and maybe the 12th, can be the most challenging, but especially the first. And this is because the first house is our body, it's our personal expression, it's our birth experience into this world. And it can be challenging to have this limiting, hardship-oriented planet, responsible, dutiful, serious, sober, controlling, constricting, on ourselves, right? It's like our body, ourselves. It's like one of the most personal of all of the houses. And so we can really see it in an obvious way when someone has Saturn in the first house. Britney Spears has Saturn in the first house, for example, and you can see she was extremely controlled and manipulated by her family. And Saturn is making an aspect to, I think, Pluto in her fourth. So if I'm not mistaken, she is again kind of showing that her life has been restricted or hard and limited in some way. So let me start off with the birth. So the ascendant is how we are born into the world. Planets here will describe that experience for us. And so Saturn on the ascendant can describe having a difficult birth, having a late birth, resisting coming out into the world. Like, I'm going to crawl back in there. I don't want to be out here. And this is also going to kind of show you later in life how you will respond to maybe things that start, or like jumping into things, your initiative, your sense of action, or beginning things like you began this life. You may have a hesitancy. You may kind of be more reserved in your decision making, less impulsive, kind of wanting to analyze things and be extremely conservative in your approach to making decisions or taking risks. Like, do I really want to do that? I don't know. And so Saturn on the ascendant can influence you in your decision-making process by delaying it, and by you maybe having more self-doubt. Like, is this the right decision? I don't know. Can I trust myself? Like, am I going to follow through with this? But what's ironic is that Saturn on the ascendant also makes you very hardworking. So it's like you can rely on yourself. You have everything that you need. You can do it. You will follow through. And it's really just about believing that you have everything that it takes, and then trusting your decisions when you do make them. Saturn on the ascendant can also make you very sober or serious. This will depend on the rest of your chart as well, but I have seen this with clients. They will kind of be like stoic and non-reactive, and it's usually because Saturn on the ascendant just creates this kind of mask. Like, I'm going to put up this mask of, protection so that I don't have to face the world in a very like raw and vulnerable place. So some people, that mask might turn out to look like quite serious, and for others that mask might look like what they think society wants them to look like a traditional kind of person that checks all of the boxes. And they can sometimes over identify with the mask. They might not even know that they are wearing a mask in some ways. And so they can have trouble expressing their true vulnerable nature to the world. And as a result, sorry, my dog is making so much noise in the background. As a result, they can really self-censor and limit themselves, and they might not even fully know how much they're doing it because they are identifying with that self-limitation. They're identifying with that mask. And so it might take some time to really peel back the layers to get down to the raw, true, authentic self, and for them to realize, wow, I've been holding myself back. Wow, I haven't expressed what I thought in like all these different scenarios. And so they can really struggle with spontaneous action, spontaneous expression, and passion, spontaneous passion, spontaneous self-assertiveness. So things that require your reaction in the moment, and especially assertiveness, because Saturn can really, Freudian slip there because Mars has to do with assertiveness. But Saturn can really be that process of let's delay, let's think, let's know everything and analyze everything before we take steps. And Mars is the opposite planet that wants us to be assertive, act almost impulsively, act on our passions, and really stand up for and take care of ourselves. And I definitely see this as a process of becoming with Saturn in the first, where you have to learn how to really stand up for yourself, to really have those boundaries when necessary. And it's oftentimes because in childhood, they had way too much responsibility. And so they maybe had to take on a lot of shit from other people. They maybe didn't realize that they had to set those boundaries because they couldn't really in childhood. Like, oh, I have to survive at my home. I have this kind of really serious childhood dynamic where I'm having to step up and own a lot. I know one person had to take care of all their siblings, and she grew up in a super strict religious household. I think she was like Amish or Mormon or something, but on the stricter end. And then she and it was abusive on top of that. So it was like a lot of responsibility and growing up happening from a very young age, which is super common with Saturn in the first house. And then it becomes harder to not continue to take on these responsibilities, to not continue to feel guilty if you assert yourself and have boundaries or say no. And it's like they have to learn this process, and they almost have to learn, or they almost end up learning by being defensive. Like, okay, I'm now being taken advantage of. I'm now being attacked. So I'm going to protect myself. Or I see them, or I see someone and I think that they could hurt me. I think they could come after me. So I'm going to lash out at them first to protect myself. So it's like, it's the defensive mode rather than fully owning the boundaries in like a healthy way at all times, if that makes sense. It's a reactionary response, which does make sense for relationships, but there are times when having like and holding the structure in the container for yourself should exist alone without the relationship. Okay, I don't feel like I'm explaining that well, so I'm going to move on. An example of this though could be like, okay, I see that somebody's going to break up with me, so I'm going to do it first. So I'm going to defend myself from this attack rather than hold the strength and the boundaries within myself and realize that, you know, I can approach them, have a conversation. If things aren't going the way I want, you know, I can handle that situation, that type of thing. And so I do personally believe it's because they grew up with so much hardship and responsibility and so much weight on their shoulders that now there is like this super like self-protection mode on. Like, I have to survive. The survival self-protection mode is activated times 100, and they have to really, they respond to life through that lens of needing to survive, needing to do what's expected of them, or just all the things I've mentioned. And so it can be a little bit difficult for them. Again, they may have trouble with just self-expression, so they can come across sober, serious, shy, stiff, and they can't just let their wild side out as easily. But because of this, people really trust them. They are considered responsible. They are leaders. People really think that they're reliable, and they tend to give them more higher up positions. And so this is like something that they've earned because they've been doing this for themselves since they were kids, right? Like, they've already been working super hard. And so the society just naturally will start to recognize that. In general, Saturn is where we tend to have a lot of fear, anxiety, and a lot of uncertainty about ourselves. So a lot of insecurity. So these people may be highly suspicious. They may lack confidence. And it's a lot about keeping life, others, and things at arm's length to protect themselves, to preserve themselves, which is, again, a response from childhood where they may have really been hurt and really been their boundaries intruded upon. So then they kind of push and they keep things at a distance. So it could be, again, better or worse depending on actually what is appearing in the chart. The first house is also the body. So there can be physical health concerns, not only in the birth where they may have had a traumatic birth or a difficult birth, delayed birth, things like that. But they can also have just physical issues surrounding like rigidity or dryness. So this could be like brittleness in the bones, for example. Saturn, Capricorn rules over bones, and Saturn is like a very dry, cold energy. So that's just one example, but it could be any kind of bone deformity or issues in that sense, arthritis, osteoporosis, anything related to bone issues. So at the end of the day, those with Saturn in their first house or on the ascendant are here to learn the true expression of themselves, to embrace life, to not push it away, to learn, you know, who and when to trust, and to allow this kind of passion and energy to move through them freely and out into the world. So that's what I'm seeing for Saturn in the first. Let's move on to the fifth house. All right, so Saturn in the fifth house, the Leo house, can create difficulty and restrictions around our self-expression. So the fifth house is where we honor our innate gifts, where we value ourselves, where we are willing to put effort into our interests and what we're good at and develop them and allow ourselves to express them. Here, with Saturn here, this may be a source of pain or difficulty where we feel like our creative energy is maybe blocked in some capacity, or we feel like when we're trying to express ourselves, like we're not really doing good enough, or we may take it very, very seriously to the point where so they may actually like do it for work, for example, where they feel like they need to be perfect and get everything down super well, and make money from it. So Shakira is an example of this. You know, she's an amazing singer and dancer, but she's very perfectionistic, very, very hardworking. And she takes this idea of her innate skills and all of this and puts a lot of duty and responsibility on it, which is Saturn in the 5th house. So it's not just, oh, this is my creative self-expression, I'm going to go have fun. This is serious business. I have to be perfect. I have to show up 110%. And you really see that with Saturn in the 5th house. Sometimes though, it can mean that you are kind of creatively blocked and you have hardships in this area of your life where you may have trouble kind of giving in to the natural pleasures and desires and interests that you have. And also as a result can have trouble with your creative self-expression. So in many ways, you might want to shine bright. You might want to be seen, but you might feel like you are invisible, or like people don't enjoy you or don't like you or don't give you the admiration that you would like. The 5th house has a lot to do with this kind of Leo energy of admiration. And so with Saturn here, it's like you're craving it, but you're also missing it and you have to give it to yourself. So it's about really allowing yourself to honor those internal gifts, and admire your execution of them, admire your process, and not really rely on that from the outside world. Sometimes you can appear as maybe stiff or having trouble in social situations, being awkward or uncomfortable in just your movement or your natural way of being, or even like your seductiveness. All of those things you can kind of have more stiffness around. That's not always going to be the case. Again, it's all dependent on the chart. Like look at Shakira with Saturn in the 5th house. She's incredibly, beautiful and seductive and all those things and doesn't appear stiff at all. So again, it's going to be dependent on your chart. Oftentimes as a child, you were maybe not recognized for your uniqueness, and your parents may have tried to mold you into who they want you to be. Or you may be like that with your children because the 5th house is also your children. You may also have delays or hardships in general around having children, or you might have very serious children. Again, they might just come later in life. For example, Shakira didn't have kids and meet her partner until later in life. So all these things can kind of be related to your relationship with your children, or even the way that you were treated as a child. You might have, again, difficulty with your children, but it could be in particular raising them. So maybe like one of you, like you have a full-time job and you have a kid and you're a single mom, your child might feel more like a burden, or might feel like it's really a heavy responsibility that maybe you weren't necessarily prepared for. As I mentioned, there can be a desire for popularity or to have what somebody else has, or again, that admiration. And so this is where Saturn can become an issue, because what you really actually need is something much deeper than that. It's not like you need actual people to praise you. What you need is internal self-acceptance and self-love and self-validation. And so you are on a search from your external environment here for kind of the praise and recognition that you deserve, but that you really deserve to give yourself. And so this may develop into a fear sometimes of putting themselves out there, because on one hand you really crave it, but on the other hand you also don't know how to get it, and you might not have a strong relationship with how to get this praise. So you might avoid putting yourself out there into the light, or you might put yourself out there a lot and have a weird relationship with it. You may also kind of be fearful of giving your heart away, because the 5th house is where we are driven by our heart, where we are also dating and meeting people for the first time. And so you might approach these situations, you might approach your dating life with fear, and start to attract not exactly the kind of partners that you would want to attract as a result of how you are stepping into the situation emotionally. So again, the journey is to discover your inner light, to shine it bright, to love and accept yourself and your innate gifts, to give yourself that internal praise and validation, and express yourselves without inhibition and without having to be perfect and make something out of everything. It's okay if you want to make something out of your art, out of your talents, out of your gifts. But when you take it to the point of kind of hurting yourself or feeling like you're never doing good enough, that is when you're taking it too far. You also may need to learn how to just let your hair down and have fun without feeling guilty. Like, I can go out and party. I can go out and be with these friends and have a drink and travel and do my hobbies without feeling like, oh, I'm not being responsible enough, or I'm not thinking long term enough, or what am I going to make out of this or do for this long term. Maybe there's just, an ability for you to just let everything go and not care and just totally relax and not have to put so much responsibility and meaning, because the fifth house is a house of pleasure, of joy, of fun. So having Saturn here can create restrictions or guilt around just having those simple pleasures and joys and fun in life. So leisure time might not feel as natural to you. It's important to kind of schedule that leisure time. Also, dating and sex can be a really serious topic for you. So it's not just like, oh, I'm going to have kids, like, yeah, whatever, or I'm just going to date whoever. It's like, no, this is serious. I'm going to be very responsible in who I choose. Or you may, if that's not the case, you may attract Saturnian type dating partners and have difficult dating relationships initially. There can be a need to work on boundary issues related to children if Saturn is retrograde. And yeah, that's what I'm seeing. So if that resonates, let me know. Now we're going to move on to Sagittarius. Okay, so Saturn in the 9th house, aka the house of Sagittarius. I know people personally who have this, and I'm really close with them actually. And yeah, I find it not a bad placement at all, to be frank. The 9th house is generally a very positive one. So to have a malefic or challenging planet like Saturn here, it's like it's trying to do its work, and it does a little bit, but it's really not going to hurt you that much typically. So how I usually see this manifest, the 9th house is our house of faith, hope, beliefs, and our philosophy about life, our perception of the world in a huge extent. And so Saturn here can often make one a little bit pessimistic, or at the very least quite cynical about life. So they might be a little bit more suspicious. They might be like not as trusting, and they don't just take answers as they're given, or they don't just believe that everything works out always for the good, or they can see kind of the issues of society. They can see where people let people down. They can see how the structure of the government is failing us. They can be cynical, and that's essentially what I'm trying to say. So this can also kind of pour into religion as well. So they may not be religious at all. They may be like, I don't believe in religion. I'm cynical about that. Or they may be super religious, because Saturn can be really strict and be like, I am dogmatic, I am disciplined, I am 100% on this. Or they could have grown up in a very religious, strict household, which I see a lot actually. People who are told what to believe and told how to behave and told what they can and can't do according to a religious system. And then oftentimes they have to later go on and learn how to define what their beliefs are for themselves, because wherever Saturn is, we have a journey to provide that for ourselves. So just like Saturn in the 5th house was maybe looking for admiration from the outside, they have to give that to themselves. Saturn in the 9th house has to give themselves their own definition of life, of philosophy, of what they believe, what they think is true, not true, what they want to invest into. And so they might start off surrounded in an environment with things that don't agree with them, that don't feel right to them. And they have to learn how to slowly kind of parse out what their truth is in this scenario. And so they may encounter difficulties that force them to reframe their belief system, and they may have to question everything. And they can have a loss of faith. Like I said, starting off in a really religious household and then turning completely non-religious would be an example of this. And then they can have general skepticism that can prevail until they've at least established a new belief system. So maybe in the process of rejecting their old and transitioning to the new, maybe they become atheist. They're like, I don't believe in this religion. I don't believe in any religion. And then 10 years later, they're like, actually, Buddhism sounds a lot more interesting to me. Christianity didn't really resonate, but Buddhism sounds good. And so they kind of find their own way, and they might go through certain extremes in order to get to their end goal and something that feels right for them. Sometimes this placement, again, can lead to remaining in atheism or having no faith and being overly reliant on logic and understanding rather than having kind of a pairing between both logic and faith and hope and belief and things that are somewhat illogical or not based off of a fact or of something that you can see. And so, sort of like having with Saturn in the 12th house, there can be a fear of what is unknown or a fear of things that can't be defined, that can't be tamed, that can't be put in a box, that can't be controlled. So anything abstract, they can have a fear or a rejection of those things. And again, it's until they learn how to establish their own relationship with the abstract that they can settle into something more comfortable. There is a fear and a fighting against that which cannot be. Oh, I already said that. They may sometimes be depressed also. The 9th house is our sense of optimism and believing that life has our back. Very similar to 12th house. They can kind of feel like, oh, the glass is half empty. Oh, life is not working out for me. Things aren't going that well. And so they can kind of, this loss of faith can turn into a hopelessness, which can turn into depression. And so that is a little bit hard. And also because they're very tuned into the difficulties of the world. They're skeptical and cynical because they see the world around them and they're like, okay, there's children in China working 12-hour days and very injured and like, what is wrong with this world? And so they see all of that. They're very tuned into that and they're not ignoring it. And so as a result, they can be kind of depressed, like, oh, I can't do anything about that. This is how life is. This is the reality of the situation. I can see that super clearly. And as a result, I'm feeling a little bit depressed. The 9th house is also our sense of morals and integrity. And so these people tend to have a very strong sense of justice, of fairness, of equality, of wanting what is right in a situation. What they define as right or what they define as just will be different based off of what their belief systems are at the end of this whole progress. So that might take some time, but they are going to be someone that sticks to or adheres to what they really, really believe in. And they will fight for it. They will defend it. Their integrity will operate according to that. So that you're not going to see this kind of, what's the word when people like don't do what they say? Hypocritical. You won't see this kind of hypocritical. There's like a sense of alignment of this is what I say, this is what I think, this is what I do. And they're living according to this kind of internal dogma, whether it's a belief in nothing or a belief in tons of things. They are usually concerned for the well-being of others. They can be very pragmatic and it can steer them away from trusting their intuition. And so they can sometimes fear the future without the use of these tools. So they might be people who are actually very intuitive, who don't trust that, who don't allow themselves to be like making full decisions based off of a gut feeling. And so as a result, they can feel a little bit more detached from their guidance system, which can lead to more fear. If you're not sure how you're going to get somewhere, you can be scared about what's around the next corner. And so the more that we have faith in something outside of us, the easier it is to be comfortable and confident in this lifetime. And so as these individuals detach themselves from that or don't trust that within themselves, they can lose their way a little bit. They can be less comfortable. Again, they might have grown up in really religious households and they could be strictly religious themselves. They often will become disillusioned with philosophies they've inherited till they eventually find their own way of viewing the world. They become their own inner authority because what are belief systems? It's usually about what we want to invest in that already exists out there. So I want to believe that the government has my back. I want to believe that Christianity is the right religion. I want to believe that my teacher is going to do this thing for me. So there is kind of a reestablishment that I'm my own authority. The government's not going to tell me what to do. The Christianity doesn't actually align with me. It's like I'm my inner authority. And then you can then define from there what you want to believe or act on. They become their own teachers, uncovering the truth. A really big part of them is they are very strong truth seekers in many ways. They can also, the 9th house has to do with traveling abroad, higher education. So they may struggle or have delays around this or be very hardworking in these areas or have both going on. So they might struggle to kind of fit in from abroad, or if they are like moving, like let's say they're from Spain, they're moving to the US as a child, they may feel like they're always a little bit foreign, or they don't fully fit in, they don't fully integrate. Or let's say they want to move back to Spain, they have trouble with paperwork or delays, they have more work to do to go back there. Or let's say they want to go to get their master's degree. It's not that they can't, but it might take them 6 years instead of 3 years or 2 years. So there can be kind of these hurdles to overcome in these areas of life. So that is what I'm seeing for Saturn in all of the signs. If you guys enjoyed this, please do subscribe, share this with your friends, like and comment down below. And definitely check out my website, willspoon.com, if you want your own astrology reading. I also have a super fun quiz about what planet best represents you. So maybe some of you will have Saturn. So definitely check that out on my website, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.